Hi, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to be doing a book review and some thoughts about a painter named James Whistler. So many years ago, back to the 1980s, I bought this book and I was interested. I noticed it in the shop because it had a quality that seemed like it would be a collectible book. So I bought it, and it says in here I bought it for $20. And it's pretty nice bound, but it's got these nice thick pages and nice printing. Anyway, here it is all these years later. I finally got around to reading it, and I looked it up on the internet to see the value, and it is going for between $20 and $50. So if you include inflation, it didn't really raise in value at all. So it's just interesting. Sometimes you see a book that you think might be a great value in the future, and they don't do anything. I do have a few books in my collection that have gone up, but it's actually very rare for the books that I buy for them to go up in value. But anyway, today we're talking about this book. It's called The Life of James McNeill Whistler. It's written by, this edition is printed in 1911. I think it was published in 1909. And it's two authors, E.R. and J. Pennell. This is a wife and husband team doing this. J. Pennell is the male of the partnership, and he was an artist himself. He was a etcher and illustrator, and he was a very prolific guy. He produced a lot of stuff during his life, but he was a great friend of Mr. Whistler. Many people had approached Whistler and told him that he should write an autobiography or have somebody write his biography, and Whistler asked Pennell to write the biography. So here we have it. And for its time, I think it's a very, very good book for its time. It's filled with lots of great anecdotes. And one of my favorite things about this biography and artist biography is where the author includes lots of conversations that were in the artist's voice. And Pennell knew Whistler. He corresponded with him. He had access to Whistler's correspondences. He interviewed Whistler about his life. So it might seem that the Pennells were kind of biased towards Whistler, but as you'll see, as I'm going to discuss, there's several objective evaluations, and there's many negative things about Whistler in this book. To the credit of the authors, they did what seems to be a pretty honest biography. So Whistler was born in 1834 in Lowell, Massachusetts. His father was an engineer, meaning that he designed railroads, and he lived in Germany for a while. And so Whistler lived in Germany, was familiar with Europe. He had a very kind of sophisticated juvenile education because he lived in Europe, studied in Europe, and was familiar with all these countries compared to so many other Americans of his time. And it's interesting too that Whistler was an American artist. He studied art in Paris, and then he spent a lot of time in England, and then he went to Venice, and he lived in other parts of the continent. But he was very much a European man. But he always considered himself American, and he even considered himself Irish for his heritage. Now it's interesting too that his birth year is within several years of all the other Impressionists. Manet, Degas, Renoir, Monet. He was really of their time. So it is very interesting to me as a kind of an art historian, where they developed this, very explosive color that they introduced to the world, and really painting outdoors. Whistler stuck to the more blacks. He really admired Rembrandt, and so he thought, you can't ever go wrong with all the blacks, and so he stuck with that. But it's interesting how where he grew up and how he grew up set him apart from those French painters. So I think that is interesting. And Whistler was a very, very popular artist in his time, and he was very controversial, and his paintings did sell, and they increased in value. And I was looking at some charts on Google Ngram. Whistler's popularity compared to the other Impressionists. Okay, this chart here is from Google Books Ngram Viewer, which charts the number of times a name is mentioned in a book. And this goes from 1870 to the year 2000. We can compare Whistler to the other Impressionists, Monet, Manet, Renoir, Degas. Whistler is the blue line. You can see in 1900 his popularity really increased to hyper levels. He died in 1903, so right after his death he was just very popular. I mean, everybody was talking about James Whistler at this time. Then his popularity declined sharply, and it's been gradually declining, until the year 2000, where his popularity was about the same as Monet, Manet, Renoir, and Degas. Whistler was very bold to be an American, an outsider, and go to London and try and to sell his paintings. Whistler was, even though he is kind of conservative, he was trying to introduce some new progressive ideas into the English art. I'm doing a book review, but I'm going to insert some of my own opinions here. I'm not a big fan of Whistler. One reason is because of the blacks, because of all his blacks and his portraits. His portraits are very full body portraits, and to me, the bottom 2/3 of all his portraits are kind of wasted. There's not much distinguishing going on in the body of the sitter, in the subject that he's painting. There's not much going on, and so I'm like, it looks like wasted space. And then when I do close-ups to the portraits, the faces are okay, they're not that interesting. And then of course there's the Whistler's, the outdoors of the etchings, and he did those in real life. Sometimes it says he did do them by memorization, but they don't really stand out to me. Now that said, I always have to remember that I'm looking at reproductions. I'm looking at really small reproductions of the originals, and I know that his paintings are pretty large. So before I'm giving some opinions on Whistler, I'm not giving my definitive opinion on Whistler because I haven't seen the real thing. And I always want to say that before you give a definitive opinion on a painter, you should see the work in real life, because it's different and they deserve to be evaluated in real life and not just from books and reproductions. The colors can be wrong. A lot of the stuff I see from Whistler, it looks like it's out of focus. I would say his work does not reproduce very well. And one of the things he was kind of doing was creating an atmosphere. I mentioned that it kind of seemed like it was that blurry. And I think he was trying to create an atmosphere, and it's just hard to carry that over with the etchings. If I really look at them for a little while, I kind of get the atmosphere feeling, but my immediate response is, yeah, okay, what's going on here? It's kind of hard to tell what his subject is because he's doing the atmosphere. Back to the biography. We get a great look into Whistler's personality. Gosh, there's just so much material in here that's really excellent. Whistler was a really prickly guy. Whistler could be rude, he could be insulting, he was persnickety, he was combative and fiercely mean. I'd say pride was Whistler's worst vice. But to his credit, he did befriend many of the English elites, and he was friends with Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854, so he was 20 years younger than Whistler. But for a while, Whistler and Oscar Wilde were great friends. One thing that put them together, they were both kind of outsiders in London society, and Whistler considered himself an Irishman, and Oscar Wilde was born in Ireland, so they had those kind of things in common. But they both could be very acerbic, very snobby, and were really proud of saying exactly what's on their mind. So you put those two kind of personalities together, and sooner or later, they're going to have a conflict. In the case of James Whistler and Oscar Wilde, what occurred was that they started talking about art, and Whistler realized that Oscar Wilde didn't really know much about art. That was really a social failing. If a person talked about art and they really didn't know about art, Whistler was going to criticize you. And also Oscar Wilde was listening to Whistler, and he was taking things that Whistler said and repeating them to other people. And this really infuriated Whistler. So they argued, and Whistler accused him of stealing his thoughts, plagiarizing him. The relationship really deteriorated as time went on. And Whistler's personality, he liked to shock people. Let's give some examples here. Whistler is famous for saying, "I'm not arguing with you, I'm telling you." It was thought, no, here's Pennell on Whistler. It was thought that he could not live without fighting, that to him battle was the spice of life, but he never fought until fighting was forced upon him. Every man was a friend until he proved himself an enemy. Whistler's temper was violent. Few who ever saw him roused can forget the fire in his eyes, the fury of his face, the sting of his temper. He was terrible then and lost all control of himself. So he had a great ego, and he was a vain man, but he does have an extraordinary commitment to art. He created a lot of art. He worked very hard. He was just very sensitive to criticism. There's a whole chapter of his life where John Ruskin libeled him in print, and Whistler went to court to prove that he had been libeled. And that's the popular. You can get that story in other places. Pennell goes on to say, "There was always good cause for his rage, and once the storm had passed, he laughed. He liked to fight, and he roared over it." Whistler was also a dandy. He had expensive clothes, and he wore them in an impeccable manner. He had very delicate hands, and he did appreciate the decorative quality of art. But there is one great story at the end. Pennell, when he's kind of wrapping things up, he has a very poignant story where Whistler knew the young artist Aubrey Beardsley, and he kind of, he knew Beardsley, but he wasn't very impressed by his work at first. And then one time, Beardsley illustrated Alexander Pope's poem, "The Rape of the Lock," and Beardsley was showing Whistler, he was going to show him the illustrations for "The Rape of the Lock," and Whistler looked at them, and he said, "Aubrey, I've made a great mistake. You're a very great artist." And Aubrey Beardsley was so moved that he began crying because he just so wanted Whistler's approval. So Aubrey Beardsley was crying. Whistler said, "I mean it. I mean it. I mean it." So he could be charming, but he could be combative too. And here Whistler was discussing investing with a man named Mr. Edmund Heinemann, and Heinemann kind of shamed Whistler and said, "You mean you're not on the stock exchange?" And Whistler said, "You just think you're stars, Eddie, that I'm not, because if I was, there wouldn't be room for you." So, and also Pennell, since Pennell is an artist, there's lots of stuff in here about how Whistler's process painting his subjects, Whistler's etching process, and that really adds another great layer when an artist does a biography of another artist. I've been kind of dismissive of Whistler's work, and so I wanted to include something that Pennell includes in the biography towards the end, because Whistler was friends with Auguste Rodin, and Rodin was just the greatest sculptor of the 1900s. And so when Pennell wrote Rodin a letter, Rodin wrote back, and here's what he said about Whistler. "Whistler was a painter whose drawing had great depth, and this was prepared for by good studies, for he, must have studied assiduously. His feeling for form was not only that of a good painter, it was that of a sculptor. He had an extraordinary delicacy of sentiment, which made some people think that his basis was not very strong, whereas it was, on the contrary, both strong and firm. He understood atmosphere most admirably, and one of his pictures, which made a very deep impression on me, the Thames at Chelsea, is a marvel of depth and space. The landscape in itself is nothing. There is merely this great extent of atmosphere, rendered with consummate art. Whistler's art will lose nothing in the lapse of time. It will gain. For one of its qualities is energy, another is delicacy, but the greatest of all is its mastery of drawing. So that's a very convincing and favorable opinion by the great sculptor Auguste Rodin. So thanks for watching.